Four Weddings and a Funeral didn't just break the box office, it completely resurrected the British film industry. Premiering in 1994, Mike Newell's shoestring indie dropped a cast of brilliant character actors into a quintessentially English world of rainy chapels, catastrophic speeches, and unspoken longing, where Hugh Grant's perpetually bumbling Charles and Andy McDowell's enigmatic Carrie crossed paths across 5 completely different social disasters. Across 3 decades of romantic comedy imitators, VHS box sets, and a permanent place in pop culture, the film became the absolute gold standard for British charm. Yet, behind those grand churches and that effortless wit was a saga of brutal budget cuts, freezing rain, a cast entirely convinced they were making a massive flop, and a leading man the writer absolutely refused to hire. These are 20 shocking facts about Four Weddings and a Funeral. Stick around for Fact 1, because the truth about how that iconic rainy finale actually came together is more unbelievable than anything that made it to the screen. Before we grab a glass of champagne, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss any of our deep dives into the classic films that refuse to fade away. Fact 20, the film that survived on television money. When you watch a cinematic classic, you assume there was a major Hollywood studio backing it from day one. Four Weddings had almost nothing. The initial funding for the production completely collapsed in 1992, halting the project and forcing them to recast. When they finally scraped the money together a year later, the savior wasn't a major studio. It was Channel 4, a British public service television network. The film was essentially financed as a TV movie. Nobody involved thought they were making a massive theatrical hit. They just wanted to finish the project before the TV money ran out. Fact 19. The actor congratulated for dying. Simon Callow, who played the boisterous, larger-than-life Gareth, delivered a performance so memorable that it permanently altered how people interacted with him in public. His character's sudden death at the third wedding is the emotional turning point of the entire narrative. Because the film became such a cultural touchstone, fans began blurring the lines between the actor and the character. For decades after the film's release, Callow has reported that fans frequently approach him on the street just to tell him how sorry they were that he died. As Callow himself noted, he frequently has to remind people that he was, in fact, not actually dead. Fact 18. The star who thought his career was over. Hugh Grant's anxiety on set wasn't just typical actor nerves. It was a deep, fundamental dread. During production, Newell was pushing Grant hard to play the awkwardness up, resulting in countless takes of stuttering and blinking. Newell later screened early footage of the film at Shepperton Studios. The reaction from the crew was decidedly mixed. Grant famously watched the rough cuts and genuinely believed the film was an unmitigated disaster. He confided in friends that the movie was going to completely end his acting career. 2 years later, that same performance won him a Golden Globe and a BAFTA. Fact 17. A quiet revolution in romance. Four Weddings is remembered for its broad comedy, but it did something remarkably progressive for 1994. It featured a deeply loving, committed gay relationship between Gareth and Matthew, and it refused to make a big deal out of it. There were no coming-out speeches, no tragic societal pushback. They were simply presented as the strongest, most stable, and most joyful couple in the entire social circle. When Gareth suddenly passes away, the devastation lands because the audience believed in their love completely. By treating their relationship as entirely normal, the film made a quiet, groundbreaking statement that resonated powerfully with audiences. Fact 16. The wedding ring that actually belonged to the star. In one of the film's most stressful sequences, Charles forgets to bring the wedding rings to the altar. He has to frantically borrow rings from the congregation, resulting in a heart-shaped plastic novelty ring and a massive Gothic skull ring. The prop department didn't have to look far for the skull ring. It actually belonged to Hugh Grant. He had bought it years earlier and wore it regularly. The director thought it perfectly fit the chaotic energy of the scene, so Grant simply took it off his own finger and handed it to the actor playing the groom. Fact 15. The dress that broke the internet before the internet. The film's London premiere at the Odeon Leicester Square in 1994 generated headlines. but not just because of the movie. Hugh Grant arrived with his then-girlfriend, actress Elizabeth Hurley. Because Grant was a relatively unknown actor, high-end fashion houses had largely ignored them. Versace stepped in at the last minute, loaning Hurley a black silk dress held together entirely by oversized gold safety pins. The safety pin dress became a massive global sensation overnight. It launched Hurley into international stardom and completely dominated the press coverage, providing the tiny indie film with millions of dollars in free global marketing. Fact 14. The secret of the missing jobs. Watch the film closely, and you will realize something very strange about this close-knit group of friends. You have absolutely no idea what any of them do for a living. This was a deliberate, highly calculated choice by Richard Curtis. Most Hollywood scripts obsess over establishing a character's profession to define their personality. Curtis actively stripped all of it out. His reasoning was simple and entirely accurate to real life. When you are hanging out with your oldest friends at a wedding reception, nobody introduces themselves by explaining their day job at the bank. Removing the career talk made the dialogue feel instantly more intimate and authentic. Fact 13. The poem that stopped the clocks. The funeral sequence features a eulogy delivered by Matthew, played by John Hannah. Instead of a traditional speech, he recites the W.H. Auden poem, Funeral Blues. It is a completely devastating, show-stopping moment of raw grief in the middle of a comedy. Hannah, who was relatively unknown at the time, nailed the delivery perfectly. The impact was so profound that it rippled out into the real world. Following the film's release, the publisher rushed a special pamphlet edition of Auden's poems to bookstores. It sold over 250,000 copies. A $4 million indie comedy single-handedly resurrected a 1930s poet on the bestseller lists. Fact 12. The Missing Funeral. The movie wouldn't be the same without its devastating third act. But in the original drafts of the script, nobody died. Curtis originally conceived the project as 4 weddings and a honeymoon. It was entirely comedic, focusing solely on the romantic entanglements of the core group. It wasn't until he shared the script with his friend Helen Fielding, who would later go on to write Bridget Jones's Diary, that everything changed. Fielding read it and bluntly told him the story needed stakes. It needed a shadow. She suggested adding a funeral to anchor the comedy in reality. That one piece of advice gave the film its soul. Fact 11. The title everyone hated. 4 weddings and a funeral is now considered a brilliant, perfectly balanced title. It tells you exactly what the rhythm of the movie will be. But the studio executives were absolutely terrified of it. In 1994, putting the word funeral in the title of a romantic comedy was considered box office suicide. Executives begged Curtis and the producers to change it. They pitched generic, safe alternatives. They wanted to call it True Love. They pushed hard for Rolling in the Aisles. Curtis dug his heels in and completely refused to compromise. He knew the darkness was what made the comedy work. Quick pause. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the ultimate British rom-com, hit that like button and subscribe before Charles stammers through another terrible speech. Drop a comment below with your favorite scene, and if it's Rowan Atkinson's awful wedded wife, you have excellent taste. Now back to the secrets that shaped a classic. Fact 10. The true story of 72 weddings. The chaotic, repetitive, exhausting world of the film wasn't an invention. It was writer Richard Curtis's actual life. Over the span of 11 years, Curtis realized he had attended a staggering 72 weddings. He was caught in a relentless cycle of rented suits, terrible speeches, and awkward receptions. At one of those weddings, a fellow guest propositioned him. Curtis politely turned her down. He spent the rest of his life regretting it. That exact feeling, the terrifying realization that you might have just let the right person slip away at a social function, became the entire emotional engine for Charles and Carrie's relationship. Fact 9. The massive gamble on a tiny paycheck. Because the film's financing was perpetually on the verge of collapse, nobody was getting rich up front. Hugh Grant, who carried the entire emotional weight of the film, was paid a mere £35,000 for the role. And that was only after his agent fiercely negotiated a £5,000 raise from the original offer. Andy McDowell took a massive 75% pay cut just to get the movie made, accepting $250,000 upfront. But she was smart. In exchange for the low salary, she negotiated for a percentage of the film's profits. When the movie unexpectedly exploded into a $245 million global phenomenon, McDowell reportedly walked away with around $3 million. The indie gamble paid off immensely. Fact 8. The American stars who almost took the lead. Andie McDowell's Carrie is the magnetic center of the film, the glamorous American who completely destabilizes Charles's life. But she was not the first choice. Jean Tripplehorn was originally cast in the role, but had to step away abruptly due to a family tragedy. The producers scrambled. They offered the role to Marissa Tomei, who turned it down to care for her sick grandfather. Sarah Jessica Parker was also heavily considered. McDowell finally got the script while she was in London doing press for Groundhog Day. She saw an independent, unapologetic woman who knew exactly what she wanted and signed on immediately. Fact 7. The audition tape that shouldn't have worked. When Hugh Grant was trying to win the role of Charles, he didn't rely on a traditional screen test. He knew the character was defined by his inability to speak smoothly in public settings. So Grant handed the producers something deeply personal. He gave them a VHS tape of himself delivering a real-life best man speech at his own brother's wedding. In the video, Grant stands in front of his family, stammering, stumbling over his words, and mercilessly making fun of a sty on his brother's eye. It was awkward, hilarious, and completely authentic. That tape proved he wasn't just playing a character, he inherently understood the specific humiliation of a terrible wedding speech. Fact 6. The 2-for-1 vigor. Rowan Atkinson's bumbling Father Gerald is the comedic highlight of the second wedding. Nailing every mangled vowel and awkward pause, he turns a simple ceremony into an agonizing endurance test. But look closely at the film's structure, and you'll notice something unusual about his character. Father Gerald officiates the second wedding, but he also returns as a guest at a later wedding. Why bring him back? It wasn't just for a punchline. The production budget was so tight, they literally could not afford to hire another speaking actor for that day of shooting. Atkinson was already on the payroll, so they simply wrote him into the later scene to save the cost of an extra day rate. Fact 5. The Scottish Highlands that were nowhere near Scotland. The second wedding in the film takes the cast on a picturesque journey to a sweeping, romantic Scottish landscape. Or at least, that is what the movie wants you to believe. With a budget hovering near the absolute breaking point, flying a cast and crew to the Scottish Highlands was entirely out of the question. Instead, the production stayed firmly in the south of England. The sweeping Scottish vistas were largely a magic trick of tight camera angles and carefully chosen estates in the home counties. The only genuine piece of Scotland in the entire film was a single establishing landscape shot. And the production didn't even pay for that. The cinematographer, Michael Coulter, filmed it himself while he happened to be on vacation. Fact 4. The F-bomb that saved the pacing. The movie opens with Charles and his roommate Scarlett oversleeping, realizing they are incredibly late for the first wedding, and unleashing a rapid-fire string of profanity as they scramble out the door. It is one of the most memorable cold opens in British cinema. It almost didn't exist. The original script started much slower, dropping the audience straight into the church. When they hit the editing room, the filmmakers realized the movie had a fatal flaw. It was too quiet. The audience needed a jolt of energy to understand exactly what kind of chaotic, irreverent world they were stepping into. They wrote the frantic sequence of cursing specifically to inject adrenaline into the first 5 minutes. It worked perfectly. Fact 3. A $1 million look that costs absolutely nothing. 4 Weddings looks like a film dripping with old money. The sweeping hats, the perfectly tailored morning suits, the lavish Scottish receptions. It presents a world of boundless, effortless upper-class wealth. Behind the camera, the reality was exactly the opposite. The production was practically bankrupt. Working on a razor-thin budget of around $4.4 million, the costume department simply could not afford to dress hundreds of background extras in high-end British wedding attire. The solution was wildly unconventional. The casting directors brought in a future UK Home Secretary, Amber Rudd, as their aristocracy coordinator. Her job? Call up actual minor British aristocrats and ask them a massive favor. Bring your own clothes. That sea of stunning fascinators and pristine morning coats came straight from the extras' personal closets. They essentially threw 4 fake weddings and let the guests foot the bill for the fashion. Fact 2. The leading man who was simply too handsome. Before Charles became the ultimate stammering, charming British archetype, he was designed to be something entirely different. Writer Richard Curtis didn't want a heartthrob. He wrote Charles as an ordinary, socially awkward, slightly unremarkable guy. Someone whose romantic failures made sense. Then, a floppy-haired, impossibly handsome actor named Hugh Grant walked into the audition room. Curtis hated it. He pushed back hard against the casting. To Curtis, casting someone that objectively good-looking broke the fundamental logic of the script. The director, Mike Newell, saw it differently. He knew Grant had the specific, razor-sharp comedic timing to make the bumbling work. A bitter behind-the-scenes battle followed. Curtis was finally overruled. Fact 1. The miserable, freezing truth behind the romantic climax. It is one of the most famous endings in romantic comedy history. Charles and Carrie, standing in the pouring rain, finally stripping away the terrible timing and the missed connections, agreeing to commit to each other by explicitly agreeing to never get married. On screen, it looks like pure magic. Behind the camera, it was an absolute nightmare. The scene was shot in London, and the production could not afford a comfortable, heated studio environment. They were outside. It was freezing cold. The rain wasn't a gentle cinematic mist. It was coming from massive industrial hoses, blasting freezing water directly onto the actors. They were shivering uncontrollably between takes. Andie MacDowell had to deliver her most important lines while completely soaked to the bone, trying desperately to keep her teeth from chattering. Then came the line. MacDowell looks at Grant through the downpour and says, "Is it still raining? I hadn't noticed." It is widely considered one of the worst, most nonsensical pieces of dialogue in modern film history. MacDowell knew it was ridiculous. Grant knew it was ridiculous. The crew, freezing in the mud, knew it was ridiculous. But they shot it anyway, because they were out of time and out of money. They thought they had filmed a disaster. But when the movie hit theaters, the audience didn't care about the logic of the dialogue. They cared about the relief. The exhausting 11-year journey of missed opportunities was finally over. The film that was completely starved for cash, filmed in the freezing mud, and anchored by a star who thought he was ruining his own career, had captured exactly what it feels like to finally get it right. Thanks for watching these 20 shocking facts about 4 weddings and a funeral. Which facts surprised you the most? If this trip back to the 90s brought back your favorite memories of British cinema, hit like, subscribe, and share this with a friend who still insists they aren't going to cry at the funeral scene. And until next time, keep watching back before.